Hi, this is Paul. I got a lovely DM from someone who said basically, yeah, Paul, I'm an atheist. I love your work, but why are you always so hard on Sam Harris? So I thought it might be good to say a few things about that because I hold absolutely no ill will against Sam Harris. I'm not offended by his politics, even though he's a little Trump deranged. Any mention of Donald Trump, he just sort of goes off. I don't have a problem with atheists. Many of my friends are atheists. I don't really have a problem with the guy. He just so often appears as, well, number one, inconsistent, and number two, he's a good stand-in for sort of the way that a sort of the posture of our entire civilization with respect to a number of things. And so whenever Sam talks to Jordan, or I thought his conversation with Chris Williamson was very interesting, even though I wind up yelling at the car as I'm driving somewhere listening to it, because I think, how can you keep saying this? The strange thing about Sam is I almost wish he would just stay a new atheist, but not act like a new atheist who is sort of clothed in kind of he sort of wants to be cool, like he's a new agey hipster, but at the same time be an atheist. It's sort of like he wants to say that everything is predetermined. It's kind of the whole show as described at the beginning of C.S. Lewis's book Miracles, and then at the same time spend all of his time on his podcast admonishing about this or that with respect to politics or personal life, etc., etc. So it's that combination that usually pulls me in and gets me excited about talking about Sam Harris. Now, I got a little bit of feed pushback from a couple of new atheist types on Twitter saying that, no, well, Sam and his meditation thing isn't new. He's been talking about meditation for a very long time, and he talked about psychedelics quite a bit in his conversation with Chris Williamson, and that's all true. And Sam does frame his practice of meditation and his practice of psychedelics within a materialist mindset. That's all true too. The difficulty is how he talks about it on one hand as sort of the highest thing, and then sort of again switches tracks immediately to begin admonishing about politics or the ecology or something like this. Because in one sense, if your highest being is to sort of transcend above your individuality, transcend above your personhood, and realize that your personhood is an illusion in a very Buddhist-y way, well, then you're going to probably have, you should, in terms of, okay, rationality. What is rationality? Rationality is, in sort of the easiest terms, sort of a consistency checker. Ian McGilchrist has a great video, little talk about that out somewhere, sort of a consistency checker. And so with someone like Sam Harris, on one hand, he says, well, sort of the highest thing I can do is achieve through meditation this view of truth that my personhood is an illusion, and I am somehow floating above it all, recognizing that my personhood is an illusion. All of those concerns that I have are illusory, and then switches around, and now he's concerned about everything. He's concerned about his wife. He's concerned about his children. And you say, okay, but what happened to this rationality? Because basically what you've done is constructed this entire thing upon Christian ethical assumptions, and your critique of the Bible is, as many new atheists, Bishop Barron has noted this on many times as conversation with these types, your critique of the Bible and critique of Christians is that it's not Christian-y enough, or the Bible isn't biblical enough. And you hear similar things from Bill Maher and from Scott Adams. Just recently, Scott Adams, and part of what really makes this interesting is the fact that sort of this new atheist rationality is sold as a tool that can fix everything. All we just have to do, good and bad, right and wrong, is very clear and obvious. And rationality is sort of looking at the world as it is and applying the resources we have to give us a better world. And the enemy of this is, religious dogmatism and religious institutions. Now, part of the reason that new atheism is in such significant decline is because it was always sort of propped up against the fear and threat of tyrannical religious institutions in the public square. And for that reason, it sort of crept up as with 9/11, because here you had religious fundamentalists flying planes into buildings. But most people looking at the United States, despite all of the sort of nervous chatter from certain segments of Big Eva about Christian nationalism, that religious institutions, including the Catholic Church in almost everywhere in the West, is of zero concern in terms of sort of taking over the nation states. Nobody wrung their hands when Joe Biden was running for president for fear that the Pope would now be calling the shots for the United States government in the way that people did with John F. Kennedy running for president, running for the U.S. presidency to be elected and inaugurated, or actually elected to be inaugurated the following year in 1960-61. So, I mean, that whole fear has sort of changed. Now there's sometimes this fear that, all of these Christians who are going to church, yada, yada, yada. But as you have the rise of the nuns, even that fear about Christians in their churches all getting together and talking politics and forcing a theocracy on the United States, it just isn't a serious concern anymore. The political rivals are deeply religious, but those religions really aren't sort of aligned with Christianity. It's not like all Christians vote for one party and all non-Christians vote for another party. People who attend church, people who identify as Christians, vote for both parties. And now, some people in one party might say, yeah, Christians who vote for the other party aren't real Christians, and actually both sides wind up making these kinds of claims in private usually. It's simply not the case that everything just sort of lines up as it is. We currently have a president from the Democratic Party who considers himself a faithful Roman Catholic and has his positions on all of the things that many other faithful Roman Catholics would say are inconsistent with Roman Catholicism. Before that, we had Donald Trump, who liked to stand up and hold a Bible and pay a lot of lip service to the Bible, even though through most of Donald Trump's life, he didn't pay much attention at all in terms of what he would do on Sunday morning in terms of going to church. And many people who, at least ostensibly, would make their decision about, we're going to decide who is president by who goes to church most faithfully, bypass certain other candidates that do in fact go to church very faithfully and regularly, and you can see them doing it. And now in the Republican Party, I just watched a very interesting video that one of you sent me about Vivek was just sort of upfront about his Hinduism. And so it's a deeply religious pluralist landscape. So a lot of the air has gone out of Sam Harris's anxiety because the religious institutions no longer just sort of set things up. One of the most interesting topics, though, with respect to this is marriage. Recently, my little group of marriage crisis videos sent me a video, a clip of Scott Adams talking about marriage.
You know what is the worst advice anybody ever gave? The worst advice.
Now this is the worst advice anybody ever gave. Now this is the way Scott Adams talks, of course, but before he tells us what the worst advice anybody ever gave, try cocaine or heroin or fentanyl or maybe I don't know, volunteer for the Nazi youth. I would categorize those things as the worst advice anybody ever gave. But, Scott Adams is sort of one of these atheists again who believes in rationality and materialism, and also, like Sam Harrison, sort of a the world is just chaotic, and we sort of create order out of it in our own little minds. But you could even go a long way towards the illusory thing. And again, if you really believe that is the nature of the world, that it is only our perceptions that bring order to the world, then the religious belief, even though you don't call it a religion, the religious belief that somehow you can bring about a better world by the use of reason actually makes no sense at all. This is the naturalistic problem, the Darwinian naturalist problem that many apologists have brought forward. Alvin Plantinga made the argument very lucidly. C.S. Lewis made the argument very lucidly. Basically, if our brains are only ordered to somehow survive, then we're not actually not actually able to access the rationality of the universe if it exists. And many of these people basically suggest there is no fundamental rationality to the universe, yet they want to put forward rationality as sort of the be-all and end-all of how to work one's way in the world. Well, if it really is just chaos and physics itself is not that orderly and we are just dust in the wind, then rationality really probably isn't a good thing to admonish. But again, Scott says the worst advice anybody ever got is...
Advice is follow your passion. You know what the second worst advice is?
So follow your passion is worse. Follow your passion is worse than join the Nazi youth, or here, try this fentanyl, or cocaine is a fun recreational drug, you should do it every day, or heroin will be a good time. I would categorize all of those advice as worse than follow your passions. I'm not saying follow your passions is great advice. It's just there are many worse advices. But now the second worst advice is...
Find a good mate.
That's bad advice. Is the opposite good advice? Find a bad mate. Maybe find someone who is find a heroin addict as a mate. I don't recommend that.
It's the worst advice anybody's ever given. Find a good mate. One that will make your life better. And do you know why that's the worst advice in the world? Because I'm no expert. I'm not a marriage expert. I'm just going to put this out there. So you can do with it what you will. I'm almost positive that 100% of people who get married think they picked the right one. Do you have a different feeling about that?
And this, of course, is the way he goes. And so then, if you listen to Scott Adams enough, you hear him talk about marriage, and he basically sounds like a guy who... He's tried it twice, and in fact, if you can go on Wikipedia and look up his second wife, and she was like a supermodel or something. So yeah, really hot and really smart. And now someone looking at that might say, yeah, I wouldn't really be terribly surprised if that marriage didn't work, because yeah, Scott, you sort of leveraged your fame and your wealth and all of this and your cleverness. He's an extremely clever guy. He's very articulate. He's a very smart guy to leverage all this to, marry this young, successful, hot woman, and she didn't stick with it. And you didn't meet each other. And actually, if Scott Adams would come to me and say, now, Paul, I'd like you to be a matchmaker for me, I'd probably look for a woman, maybe a lot closer to his age, probably a good-looking woman. Actually, I probably wouldn't recommend that any woman marry him. But if you follow this along and you look at sort of the line underneath, the assumption is that marriage is here to make me happy. Oh, marriage is here to make you happy. So, well, what are the alternatives of marriage? Well, if you want sex, then, get sex outside of marriage. Oh, okay. And don't get married at all and just have a series of sexual relationships. What Scott really wants is exactly from the Barbie movie that Ken said to Barbie what he wanted from her. Well, first he said, "You could be my wife." And Scott says, "No, no, 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 that's Barbie, not good." What? And so, in other words, when she's sort of sneaking up to Ken in order to liberate all of the other Barbies, that now that they have been hoodwinked because they have no natural immunity to patriarchy, I'm ready, she says to Ken, "I'm ready to be your long-term, distant, low-commitment, casual girlfriend." Ken's like, "Yeah, that's what we're looking for."
The way the question is phrased,
Yeah, okay.
you are not successful at keeping long-term relationships. Yeah, I threw the game, okay, Doc? I didn't want to be successful. I took a dive in the third round. Yeah.
Right, but it's curious to me but that isn't the case on the friendship front.
Right. It's not that long-term just friendships is able to do that.
But it's so different. Friendships, you don't get tired of the sex. I still love hanging out with Jim Vallerly, and we never, ever expect sex. Ever. Not once in 45 years. And it's so
he's clearly well into the gender binary.
There's just not that dimension to it that is always hanging over the head like the sword of Damocles over relationships. The clock's always ticking on them for when the passion runs out. And that's the dilemma everybody finds themselves in. Everybody finds themselves in it. It's just how people handle it. Some people cheat, some people leave, some people don't care. Some people just suck it up. You know, everybody has their way of dealing with it, but it's gonna happen. No one who's in a long-term relationship is gonna say, "Oh yeah, 20 years on and we still like attack each other when we walk in the door." It's just, come on.
That's true in my case.
You still attack each other?
Yeah.
Okay.
I know it makes an ugly
We just
picture.
played Stump the Band. You got me.
Sorry, man.
You got me.
Sorry.
You win
Yeah.
dinner at Pepe's.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Wow.
And then Jordan will talk about that. But now Sam Harris, you know, he's a family man and he loves his wife and he loves his daughters. And, you know, I wouldn't be at all surprised if Sam Harris made it all the way till death do us part. I have no reason to believe he wouldn't. So then you have to ask this question again about rationality, which is, well, the world is, everything is just clear out there in the world, even though every time he talks about meditation, no, then, you know, what's clear in the world is that I'm a personal agent making decisions, yada, yada, and everything's just sort of on the surface. And then we just make rational choices, and then we'll have the great world that we want. And no, I'm not saying that everybody is capable of being married or should be married. I'm not making any of those statements, but the world is just that much more complicated. And so you would imagine that this much vaunted rationality could answer the question, should people marry or not? Monogamy, yes or no? And it's quite clear that, well, Sam Harris and Bill Maher and Scott Adams all come to different answers on this score. Well, why? Is the world not that so much on the surface that you can answer these questions? Now, the person that sent me that DM basically said, yeah, but John Vervaeke is, you know, sort of into rationality, and John Vervaeke is into meditation, and you don't go after him the same way you go after Sam Harris. And I would say no. If you listen very carefully to John Vervaeke, actually, John Vervaeke is very measured with respect, much more measured with respect to what he talks about in terms of meditation than Sam Harris is. If you listen to very carefully to what John Vervaeke says about mindfulness, John Vervaeke is speaking as a cognitive scientist. Also, when it comes to these other bigger questions, John Vervaeke understands that, in fact, we are sitting atop just mounds and mounds and mounds and mounds and mounds of culture and religion and all of these things. Now, John, of course, is skeptical as to whether or not the legacy religions, as he calls them, can actually continue to, on a mass scale, productively address the meaning crisis, or even on a particular scale for him as an individual. But John Vervaeke's answer, and also about rationality, if you listen to John Vervaeke talk about rationality, he's got a much more nuanced and measured understanding of what exactly rationality is. Now with John, with his relevance realization and some of these other things, he'll talk about rationality in very different terms. He can talk about rationality in very large terms, but again, it's quite a bit more nuanced and specific. When I listen to Sam Harris talk, it's just sort of like, well, for Sam Harris, rationality is just sort of the, and as I've said many times, he's deeply Protestant. He just Protestanted his way outside of Jesus. So now you have rationality instead of Jesus, and that's the new answer for everything, unless he sort of feels that the room is kind of new agey, and then suddenly he'll drop into the meditation thing and say, oh no, meditation, because if we really do meditation, then we can sort of, get up outside of ourselves and realize that our personhood is an illusion, and yada yada yada. And you say, well, tell me about this rational agent that is our savior in terms of keeping reducing the amount of suffering for the rest of the world, and sort of a sort of this weird neo-utilitarianism sort of pops up as his governing ethic. So it's just kind of how Sam Harris is, and the reason I talk about him this way is because he's just so, number one, he's so popular, and it seems that people don't see these inconsistencies. Now, I know a lot of people in this little corner do, but I think just at a shallow level, people are like, oh yeah, rationality. We just see the world as it is. It's just sort of common sense realism out there. And, oh, but wait a minute, meditation. Oh no, I can do that too. So I'll be all Buddhist-y when I talk about meditation. But then I'll just go back to rationality, and therefore somehow the world is somehow we have a real connection with the world via our rationality, and we can reconstruct the world, and we can make the world into a better place, yada yada yada. And it just keeps switching between these ideas. I've been reading that Hideous Strength, and of course I made the comment in a previous video that Sam Harris is in some ways like Weston in Paralandra, and you get reading that Hideous Strength, and again you just sort of see this scientific worldview that comes through, at least with some of the people that are promoting NICE. Surely, Feverstone, said Busby, you're making a great mystery about nothing. I should have thought the object of the NICE was pretty clear. It's the first attempt to take applied science seriously from a national point of view. The difference in scale between it and anything we've done before amounts to a difference in kind. The buildings alone, apparatus alone. Think of what can be done. Think of what it's done already for industry. Think how this is going to mobilize all the talent of the country, not only the scientific talent in the narrower sense. 15 department directors at $15,000 a year each. Its own legal staff, its own police. I'm told its own permanent staff of architects, surveyors, engineers. The thing's stupendous. In other words, we're going to rationally, science-y, just hem in the entire world, and off we'll go. Careers for our sons, said Feverstone. I see. What do you mean by that, Lord Feverstone, said Busby, putting down his glass. Lord, said Feverstone, his eyes laughing. What a brick to drop. I've quite forgotten you had a family, James. I agree with James, said Curry, who has been waiting somewhat impatiently to speak. The NICE marks the beginning of a new era, the really scientific era. Up till now, everything has been haphazard. This is going to put science itself on a scientific basis. Now, again, if you listen to John Vervaeke in the Four Horsemen conversation and a number of these conversations, he notes that science itself really doesn't sit on a scientific basis. It's, you just don't really sort of get around this presuppositionalism. You have to start somewhere. There are to be 40 interlocking committees sitting every day, and there's going to be a wonderful gadget. Just think about this. This is just hilarious in the 1940s. And Lewis is just mocking this vision. Which when I listen to Sam Harris is, if he's not sort of putting on the Buddhist-y, meditation, we meditate to realize that that I no longer exist. I am not a person, even though the rest of my salvation story is critically involved in persons using rationality in order to construct a better world. Rationally. We've got a wonderful gadget. I was shown the model last time I was in town, by which the findings of each committee print themselves off in their own little compartment in the analytical notice board every half hour. Oh my goodness, it's the internet. It's a Slack room. Then that report slides itself into the right position where it's connected up by little arrows. AI is going to move the reports all around to exactly who they're supposed to be. It's going to do the relevance realization for us. Connect up with little arrows with all the relevant parts of the other reports. A glance at the board shows you the policy of the whole institute actually taking shape under your own eyes. There'll be a staff of at least 20 experts at the top of the building working this notice board in a room rather than the tube control rooms. Remember, he's talking about pneumatic tubes, and every now and then if you go to the bank or some other places, you see people put something in a tube and then put it in a tube and then whoop, off it goes. That's the old way. Now we're going to have screens. It's a marvelous gadget. The different kinds of business all come out of the business in different colored lights. It must cost $500,000. It will be called a pragmatometer. A pragmatometer. And there, said Busby, you see what this institute is already doing for the country? Pragmatometry is going to be a big thing. It's almost, this is the vision. Hundreds of people are going for it. Hundreds, mind you. Even more than being a never nude. Why, this analytical notice board will probably be out of date before the building is finished. Wow. And this is the vision. But again, Harris is blind to, well, goodness is just obvious. More food is better than less food. Oh, really? Is that really what your dietitian says? Oh, no. Quality food. Well, how do you know the quality food? Science tells us the quality food. The most amazing thing about our moment in time is that after thousands of years of being human beings, we still don't quite know what to eat. And we don't quite know what we've done with our food chain. And again, as pastors, I hear people talking about food. I just have to stop eating these foods and start eating those foods, but not everybody. And so, well, you're going to need your pragmatometer for that. One of you sent me, I do subscribe to Freddie DeBoer. Now, Freddie DeBoer is a real Jacobin, but he's quite a good writer. And I thought this was a deeply prescient thing, and it very much sort of hits at Sam Harris's sort of shallow idea that, well, we all know the good and it's obvious to all of us, and if we just apply rationality, then we will get there. Oh, but wait a minute. If we actually meditate, we'll realize that there is no me. So which one? I guess when I'm in Barbie land, will be all about the Buddhist meditation because chicks think the New Age thing is hot because they like to be spiritual. But if I'm going to be in Ken world, well, then I guess it's going to be rationality and patriarchy. So he starts out talking about a vibe shift and starts talking about the tyranny of affirmation. That's a lot of wind-up given that I'm about to make a prediction about political shift of sort. I'm not predicting a major social change writ large so much as I'm predicting a new or newly invigorated response to a pre-existing cultural reality, an unfortunate one. I think there's gathering dissatisfaction with a common set of tropes regarding personal agency and mental health. In particular, I think that the dominance of the therapeutic assumption, in American life. And now that therapeutic assumption isn't totally separate from, let's say, Sam Harris's vision of utopia that, at least with one eye covered, that rationality will give for all of us. Currently, an inescapable American cultural mode, particularly among the educated, is one of mandatory therapeutic maximalism and an attendant tyranny of affirmation. The therapeutic affirming mode assumes wanting and not getting is disordered and a kind of identity crime. And again, but you find almost no one is completely consistent because what they sort of develop is a justification for why what these other people want they shouldn't get. For example, with Sam Harris, what Donald Trump wants, Sam Harris believes Donald Trump shouldn't get. And so then you sort of have this worldview of two classes of people, of the deserving and those who don't deserve. And that's just sort of your moral net. That's just sort of a moral proxy between the good and the bad. And all the good are the marginalized, and those who have been denied what they want, and all the evil people have been the ones who have gotten what they want, and they want bad things. And then nobody pauses to say, well, all of the people sort of on the nice list, do they all want good things? Well, if you're disabled and your legs don't work, wanting your legs to work would be a good thing. But what if, you feel that you should, maybe you aspire to be disabled, and so you want the doctor to cut your leg off? Is that a good thing? Well, no, that's not rational. Oh. Human life is meant to be spent in a ceaseless state of feeling valid, which is to say affirmed and respected and paid attention to. This is so when Ken gets back from Barbie Land, this is what he basically says to Barbie. He says, when I was in Century City, they even asked me the time. Which is to say affirmed and respected and paid attention to and liked. Any deviation from this state is pathological and a vestige of injustice. Good people spend a great deal of their time categorically and uncritically affirming others, telling friends and strangers alike that their desires are all legitimate, their instincts always correct, their perceptions of their own needs never mistaken or misguided, their self-conception compelling. In other words, this is what I'm feeling. These things that I feel are part of my identity have been kept from me. Please, please give them to me now. Society, the government, whatever. It shouldn't actually cost anybody anything except the rich higher taxes. Correspondingly, we should all assume that anyone who is not affirming us is necessarily doing so out of a particular kind of politicized wickedness, that we are all likely motivated by racism, sexism, homophobia, and other kinds of bigotry. And if these specific accusations are not plausible, then simply by evil. The job of society is to enable every individual to achieve every desire they believe that they're entitled to. And the fundamental sin of our present order is not poverty or inequality or exploitation. Now, again, he's a real Marxist, and so he probably sees some of this, and in fact, our success in moving for some of this as, I don't know if he thinks this way, but of course Stalin believed that, and mid 20th century communists believed that the success of religion and democracy and affluence and all of that, that's what really keeps the revolution from happening. Anyway. Society writ large has the ability, right, and the duty to manage the psychiatric health of every individual. Psychiatric health entails all elements of a person's inner life, including basic aspects of the human condition like sadness, shyness, irritation, fear, disappointment, and the various other permutations of unhappiness. In other words, unhappiness is evil. If you listen to Scott Adams and Bill Maher and Sam Harris, they will all tell you the greatest good is happiness. Now, of course, Jordan Peterson slips in and says, no, actually, meaning is a better gyroscope. But of course, all of the layers of religion and culture and all of this stuff that we have beneath us, that's all trying to answer the question of what is good. There's no such thing as an appropriate negative emotion. The ratchet of expanding the number of conditions that are seen as falling under the broad umbrella of mental illness goes only in one direction. We add things to the DSM, we never subtract. The necessary and correct evolution of mental health moors over time is more and more for people finding themselves diagnosed with more and more conditions, and it's cruel and bigoted to suggest that there is an overdiagnosis problem. The actual provisioning of mental care for genuinely pathological mental conditions is and should remain ancillary to the social conversation about mental health, which must instead stay fixated on the task of prescribing behaviors that might result in the psychic unease or unhappiness of anyone, rather than on focusing on the treating and curing of medical conditions. The claims of psychiatric need are a special kind of claim which can override the wants and needs of others, and simultaneously, everyone is free to make a claim of psychiatric care need at any time. The obvious contradictions and destructive consequences of this combination are not to be explored. In other words, You know, the most privileged person in the world, let's say it's Gavin Newsom, I'm being repressed. You know, okay, Gavin, really? We do the best for others by affirming what they already believe and validating what they already want. People are happiest and healthiest when they are encouraged to think that vulnerability is more valuable than resilience and that their plan is more beautiful than their strength. And of course, in a world like this, no one will ever actually learn to play the piano because it's hard. No one will actually learn another language other than one that perhaps they were brought up in or that their neighbors spoke because it's hard. No one will actually have the physique of Ken or the figure of Barbie because as you go on into middle age, it's hard. Nothing hard will actually come. There are already some people who oppose some or all of these assumptions. I myself have written a fair amount in this regard. My work on mental health ideology, obviously with my distaste for trauma culture, is a good example. And there's a little graphic in here. Things insta-therapy won't tell you. Sometimes it is your fault. You might not love yourself completely, and maybe you shouldn't. Self-esteem comes from esteemable acts. Emotional regulation requires discipline. Some pain isn't healed. You live with it forever, or at least till death do you part. Coddling is just as bad as neglect. Ooh. Narcissistic self-focus isn't healing. Stop looking for a savior and be your own hero. I think one slipped by. What is it like when you're your own Savior and Lord? So actually, in some ways, it's sort of a backwards compliment to Sam, because he has risen above, in some ways, Bill Maher and Scott Adams in this. And Sam has sort of actually managed to create a religious app that people follow and look to him for wisdom. Now, of course, some look to Scott Adams for wisdom, but Scott doesn't take himself that seriously, and Bill Maher takes himself even less seriously. But Sam Harris, he takes himself seriously. And for that reason, Sam, you're the guy. You're the guy I like to pick on. And if we ever meet, I'll shake your hand and wish you and your marriage well. And if you would ask to hold my wallet, I would give it right over to you, Sam. I think you're a moral and upstanding person. And in fact, your life is better than the morality that you are preaching. Now, that's sometimes inverse for a lot of Christians, and that can be a problem, but this is why when it comes to the thinky-talky space, Sam Harris holds a special place in my video land, and, well, maybe that'll change. Who knows? But, yeah, Sam and John Vervaeke are on very different pages for very good reasons, even though there are some similarities between them. But that's my answer to the Sam Harris question. Leave a message. Let me know what you think.